Bleeding from a gaping thigh wound, Swift Arrow stood between hungry wolves and 3 trembling white children whose people had massacred his tribe. The dying Apache warrior never imagined that in saving these orphans, he would reclaim the fatherhood torn from him by smallpox years before. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The winter of 1876 fell upon the Montana Territory with merciless fury. Snow blanketed the rugged landscape in pristine white, transforming the pine forests into silent cathedrals of ice and shadow. The wind howled through the mountain passes like a wounded animal, carrying with it the bitter cold that could freeze a man's breath before it left his lips. Swift Arrow pressed a hand against the wound in his thigh, his fingers coming away slick with blood that appeared almost black in the fading light. The gash was deep, a cruel parting gift from the Crow warriors who had ambushed him 3 days prior. His breathing came in ragged pants, forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. The pain had become a constant companion, dulled only by the growing numbness spreading through his limb, a dangerous sign he recognized all too well. At 32, Swift Arrow had survived more winters than many of his tribesmen. His face, weathered by sun and wind, bore the marks of a life lived in constant vigilance. The scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw was a reminder of his first battle at 16. His dark eyes, once sharp as an eagle's, now strained against the approaching darkness as he sought shelter for the night. Just a little further, he muttered to himself in Apache, though there was no one to hear his words. His tribe was camped near the Yellow River, 3 days' journey to the south, if a man were healthy and the weather forgiving. Swift Arrow was neither healthy nor blessed with favorable conditions. He had been returning from a solitary hunting expedition when the Crow warriors descended upon him. Though he had managed to escape with his life, his horse, supplies, and the meat he had spent days tracking were lost to him now. Pride had led him to attempt the journey back on foot, a decision his body now vehemently protested. The light was waning quickly when Swift Arrow heard it, a sound that cut through the winter silence like a knife through flesh. A child's scream, high and terrified, followed by another, then another. 3 distinct voices raised in terror. Swift Arrow froze, his pain momentarily forgotten. White settlers had pushed into these mountains over the past years, ignoring treaties and claiming land that had belonged to his people for generations. The conflicts that followed had been bloody and brutal. Just 2 moons ago, a band of renegade warriors from various tribes had attacked several homesteads, leaving death and destruction in their wake. Swift Arrow had not participated in those raids. His chief, Grey Wolf, had forbidden it. But he knew the bitter aftermath. The U.S. cavalry had retaliated with equal brutality, caring little which Apache bands were responsible. Another scream pierced the air, closer now. Swift Arrow moved toward the sound, his injured leg dragging through the snow, leaving a crimson trail behind him. He crested a small ridge and looked down into a shallow ravine. There, huddled against a fallen tree, were 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, none older than 10. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their faces streaked with tears and grime. Their terror was not without cause. Circling them, yellow eyes gleaming in the dusk, were wolves, 7 of them, lean and hungry after weeks of scarce hunting. The Alpha, a massive creature with a graying muzzle, paced just beyond the reach of the branch. The oldest boy was waving desperately to keep them at bay. Swift Arrow knew the wolves would not wait much longer. Soon, hunger would overcome their caution, and the children would be lost. Without conscious thought, his hand moved to the knife at his belt, the only weapon that remained to him. His bow had been broken in his escape. His quiver of arrows scattered across the snowy plains. "Stay back!" the oldest boy shouted, his voice breaking with fear as he waved the branch at the approaching wolves. The younger boy clutched the small girl to his chest, his eyes wide with terror. Swift Arrow assessed the situation quickly. He could leave. These were white children, the offspring of those who had taken his people's land. Their fate was not his concern. Yet, even as the thought formed, he dismissed it. They were children, innocent of their parents' crimes. He reached for his flint, struck it against his knife, and set the end of a dead branch ablaze. Fire would hold the wolves at bay longer than an empty threat. With pain shooting through his injured leg, Swift Arrow half slid, half limped down the slope into the ravine. He positioned himself between the children and the wolves, holding the flaming branch high. The alpha wolf growled, baring yellowed teeth, but stepped back from the flames. "Behind me," Swift Arrow commanded in halting English, words he had learned from traders over the years. The children stared at him, fear of the wolves now competing with fear of the bloodied Apache warrior who had appeared like a spirit from the gathering darkness. "I will not harm you," he said, his accent thick but the words clear enough. "But they will." The oldest boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, hesitated only a moment before pushing the younger children behind Swift Arrow. "Our parents," the boy said, his voice trembling. They're gone." Swift Arrow nodded once, understanding more than the boy had said. Gone meant dead in the language of grief, a tongue he knew all too well. "I am Swift Arrow," he said simply, never taking his eyes off the circling wolves. "Ooh, and tonight, we survive." As darkness fell completely over the Montana wilderness, the wounded Apache warrior stood guard over 3 orphaned white children, the fire in his hand, the only light against the encroaching shadows, his injured leg threatening to collapse beneath him, and a long night of vigilance ahead. The night grew deeper, colder, more unforgiving with each passing hour. Swift Arrow had managed to build a small fire using branches from the fallen tree, but keeping it alive in the persistent wind required constant attention. The flames cast dancing shadows across the snow, illuminating the hungry eyes of the wolves that continued their patient vigil just beyond the circle of light. "They won't leave, will they?" the oldest boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire and the low growls of the predators. Swift Arrow shook his head. "They smell blood," he replied, glancing down at his own wound, "and they know we are weak." The throbbing in his leg had intensified. Despite binding it with strips torn from his buckskin shirt, blood continued to seep through the makeshift bandage. Swift Arrow knew that without proper treatment, infection would set in, if it hadn't already. But that was a concern for morning, if morning came. "And my name is Thomas," the oldest boy said after a long silence. "That's my brother William and my sister Charlotte." The younger children huddled together beneath a thin blanket, their eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Everyone calls her Charlie, though. Swift Arrow nodded in acknowledgement, but remained focused on the wolves. The alpha had begun testing the boundaries, edging closer to the fire before retreating into the shadows. It was a dangerous game, one that would eventually end with the wolf growing bold enough to charge. "Your parents," Swift Arrow said, feeding another branch to the flames. "What happened?" Thomas's face hardened, grief and anger battling across his features. "Men came to our homestead 3 days ago. Indians, but not like you." He seemed to struggle with this distinction. They had painted faces. "They killed Pa first when he went out to talk to them. Ma hid us in the root cellar and told us to run for the Millers' place if she didn't come back." The boy's voice broke. "We heard her screaming, then nothing. When it got quiet, We ran like she told us, but we got lost in the snow. Been walking ever since." Swift Arrow closed his eyes briefly. He knew which warriors Thomas was describing, a mixed band of young men from several tribes who had rejected their elders' counsel for peace. They called themselves the Ghost Dancers, though they had nothing to do with the sacred ghost dance of his people. They were fueled by rage and vengeance, burning and killing without discrimination. "They are not my people," Swift Arrow said finally. "And do not all who share a skin color share a heart?" Thomas looked at him with uncertainty, clearly struggling to reconcile this Apache warrior who was risking his life to protect them with the men who had murdered his parents. The younger boy, William, stirred from his half-sleep. "Are you going to kill us too?" he asked directly, his voice small but steady. Swift Arrow met the child's gaze. "No," he said simply. "I am not." Charlie looked up at him with eyes that seemed too knowing for her young age. "You're hurt," she said, pointing to his leg. Swift Arrow nodded. "It will heal," he lied, unsure if that was true. The cold was making it difficult to feel his toes, and the wound pulsed with each heartbeat. "Pa taught us about wounds," Thomas said, his voice gaining a hint of confidence. "I said a man needs to know how to patch himself up in the wilderness. We should clean it." Swift Arrow almost smiled at the boy's earnestness. "With morning light," he promised. "For now, we must keep the fire burning." A wolf howled in the distance, and the pack around them grew more restless. Swift Arrow gripped his knife tighter, wishing for his bow. With an arrow, he might take down the alpha and scatter the others. With just a knife and a weakening body, his options were limited. As if sensing his thoughts, Thomas picked up a sturdy branch and moved to Swift Arrow's side. "I can help," he said, his chin raised in determination despite the tremor in his hands. Swift Arrow studied the boy, thin, pale, exhausted, but with a spirit that refused to yield. He reminded Swift Arrow of himself at that age, before the smallpox had taken his family, before he had learned the bitter lessons of survival alone. "Yes," Swift Arrow agreed, "you can." The night wore on, a brutal test of endurance. Swift Arrow taught Thomas how to jab at the wolves if they came too close, how to make his small frame appear larger, more threatening. William eventually joined them, standing shoulder to shoulder with his brother, while Charlie fed the fire, her tiny hands working tirelessly to keep the flames alive. Swift Arrow felt his strength ebbing as the hours passed. The wound in his thigh had gone from painful to alarmingly numb, a dangerous sign. Twice he nearly collapsed, catching himself only through sheer force of will. The children noticed but said nothing, their young faces set in grim determination. Near dawn, when the eastern sky had just begun to lighten, the alpha wolf made its move. It charged forward suddenly, a grey blur of muscle and teeth aimed directly at Swift Arrow's injured leg. Swift Arrow braced himself, knife ready, knowing this would be the moment that decided all their fates. But before the wolf reached him, Thomas lunged forward with his branch, striking the animal across the muzzle with surprising force. The wolf yelped and veered away, confused by this unexpected resistance from what it had perceived as easy prey. "Get back!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with fear but resolute. The alpha retreated, shaking its head, blood staining its fur where the rough wood had torn its skin. It regarded them with newfound wariness, and as the first true light of dawn spread across the sky, the pack began to withdraw into the forest. Swift Arrow placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You have a warrior's heart," he said quietly. Thomas looked up at him, exhaustion and pride mingling on his face. "Does that mean we're safe now?" Swift Arrow gazed at the retreating wolves, then down at his own leg, now swollen and discolored beneath the bloodied bandage. The immediate danger of the wolves was passing, but their challenges were far from over. "The wolves are leaving," he said carefully. "But we must find better shelter, and soon." As the sun crested the horizon, Swift Arrow and the three children stood together in the blood-stained snow, survivors of the night but facing an uncertain day ahead. The wolves had been defeated, but hunger, cold, and Swift Arrow's worsening wound remained formidable enemies. The morning sun offered light, but little warmth. Swift Arrow leaned heavily against a pine tree, surveying their surroundings with eyes that struggled to focus. The fever had begun sometime during the night, and now it clouded his thoughts like morning mist over a valley. He knew they needed to move, to find proper shelter before another night descended, but each step sent lightning bolts of pain through his wounded leg. Thomas stood beside him, shoulders squared despite his obvious exhaustion. The boy had not complained once, though Swift Arrow could see the hunger and fatigue etched on his young face. "There might be a trapper's cabin nearby," Swift Arrow said, recalling the area from previous hunting expeditions. "White men build them near streams. The millers said there was a trapper named Hollister who lived up this way," Thomas offered, adjusting his grip on Charlie's hand. The little girl had barely spoken since dawn, her small face pinched with cold and hunger. William hovered close to his siblings, his eyes constantly scanning the trees as if expecting the wolves to return. Swift Arrow nodded and pushed himself away from the tree, swaying slightly. "We head east, toward the rising sun." "Listen for running water." They moved slowly through the forest, Swift Arrow setting a pace that his injury could tolerate while the children followed in his tracks. The snow had drifted deep in places, and more than once, William disappeared up to his waist in a hidden pocket. Each time, Thomas would pull him free, his movements becoming mechanical as fatigue deepened. By midday, Swift Arrow's condition had deteriorated. His skin burned with fever, yet he shivered violently. Twice he stumbled and would have fallen if Thomas hadn't quickly moved to support him. The boy was stronger than his frame suggested, a resilience born from frontier life. "There!" William suddenly called out as pointing ahead. "I see smoke!" Swift Arrow squinted through the trees. A thin wisp of grey rose against the pale sky about a quarter-mile ahead. Someone had a fire going, which meant shelter. "Could be anyone," Swift Arrow cautioned, thinking of trappers who might shoot an Apache on sight, or worse, the ghost dancers who had orphaned these children. "We have to try," Thomas said firmly. "You need help, and Charlie can't last much longer in this cold." Swift Arrow knew the boy was right. The little girl's lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and she had stopped complaining about the cold, a dangerous sign. "Stay behind me," Swift Arrow instructed, though he knew his ability to protect them was compromised by his condition. Still, he drew his knife and led the way toward the smoke. As they approached, the outline of a small log cabin came into view. It was sturdy but simple, the kind of shelter a solitary trapper might build for seasonal use. A thin plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney, but there was no movement around the structure, no horses tied outside. Swift Arrow held up a hand, signaling the children to wait while he crept closer. Each step was agony, but he forced himself forward, senses alert despite the fog of fever. He circled the cabin cautiously, noting the lack of fresh tracks in the snow, save for some small animal prints. The door was closed but not barred from outside. Returning to the children, he gestured them forward. "I believe it is empty, but we must be careful." At the cabin door, Swift Arrow knocked once, then again more firmly. When no response came, he pushed the door open, knife raised defensively. The interior was dim but mercifully warm. A small fire smoldered in the stone fireplace, clearly burning for some time without tending. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs and a narrow cot comprised the furnishings. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and pelts were stacked neatly in one corner. The cabin smelled of smoke, pine, and something else, a medicinal scent Swift Arrow recognized from his tribe's healing ceremonies. "Hello?" Thomas called out, peering around Swift Arrow. No answer came. Swift Arrow gestured the children inside and closed the door behind them, shutting out the biting cold. "Whose place is this?" William asked, his eyes wide as he took in their surroundings. Swift Arrow shook his head. "Unknown, but they left recently." He pointed to the still-burning fire. Charlie broke away from Thomas and walked to the fireplace, holding her small hands toward the warmth. "It's nice here," she said, her voice soft but clear, the first words she had spoken that day. Swift Arrow sank heavily onto one of the chairs, no longer able to hide his weakness. The room swam before his eyes, and he gripped the table edge to steady himself. "You need medicine," Thomas said, watching him with concern. "In my pouch," Swift Arrow managed, gesturing to the leather bag tied at his waist. "Willow bark." "Bitter taste." Thomas retrieved the pouch and found the strips of dried bark inside. "What do I do with it?" "Boil in water," Swift Arrow instructed, his voice fading. "Make tea." While Thomas searched for a pot, William explored the cabin more thoroughly. "Look," he exclaimed, pulling a jar from a shelf. "Honey," Swift Arrow nodded weakly. "Good for wound." The next hour passed in a blur for Swift Arrow. He was vaguely aware of the children working around him, Thomas boiling the willow bark tea, William and Charlie gathering clean cloths and water. At some point, they helped him to the cot, where he collapsed gratefully. "We need to clean the wound," Thomas said, his young face serious as he rolled up Swift Arrow's legging to expose the gash. Swift Arrow hissed in pain, but nodded permission. The wound was angry and swollen, with red streaks beginning to extend up his thigh. Blood poisoning, a killer if not treated. As Thomas carefully cleaned the wound with water warmed by the fire, Swift Arrow studied the boy's face. There was fear there, but also determination. The child had seen death before. His parents' murders were still fresh. Yet here he was, fighting to prevent it from claiming another life. My wife," Swift Arrow said suddenly, the fever loosening his tongue. "She was a healer. She would know what to do." Thomas looked up, surprise crossing his features at this personal revelation. "Where is she now?" Swift Arrow closed his eyes, the memories washing over him like a cold river. Gone, many winters ago, her and our son. Smallpox. Charlie, who had been silently watching from the foot of the cot, moved closer and placed her small hand on Swift Arrow's arm. "We lost our ma and pa too," she said simply. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of shared loss, of grief that transcended the differences of their worlds. Swift Arrow looked at these 3 children, orphaned by violence his people had suffered as well, and felt a protective surge he had not experienced since his own son's death. "Rest now," Thomas said, echoing words he had likely heard from his own parents in times of illness. "I will keep watch." As Swift Arrow drifted into fevered sleep, his last conscious thought was that these children, these white children he had no obligation to save, had possibly saved him instead. Fever consumed Swift Arrow like a wildfire through dry grass. For 2 days, he drifted between consciousness and delirium, his body battling the infection that threatened to claim him. In his fevered dreams, he ran with his son across open plains, hunted with his father in mountain forests, and held his wife beneath starlit skies. Then the dreams would darken, and he would see them all fade away, consumed by the spotted sickness that had devastated his tribe years before. Throughout his ordeal, the children remained vigilant, Thomas applied honey to the wound as Swift Arrow had instructed, while William kept the fire burning steadily. Charlie, small but determined, would dampen cloths in cool water and place them on Swift Arrow's forehead when the fever burned hottest. "Is he going to die?" Charlie asked on the morning of the third day, her voice small but direct as she watched Thomas change the bandage on Swift Arrow's leg. Thomas hesitated, his young shoulders bearing a weight no child should carry. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But we're doing everything we can." "Pa always said a man's got to fight his own battles sometimes," William added from his post by the fire. "Maybe this is his battle." Charlie considered this with solemn eyes. "Then we should help him fight." The cabin had yielded unexpected resources during their exploration. A small store of dried meat and beans in a bear-proof cache outside, fishing line and hooks tucked in a tin box, and most valuably, a leather-bound journal that contained crude drawings of plants alongside notes about their medicinal properties. Thomas had been studying this journal intently, comparing the illustrations to the dried herbs hanging from the cabin's rafters. "I think this one," he said, reaching for a bundle of greenish-brown leaves tied with twine, "is for fever. The picture looks the same." William approached and sniffed the herbs cautiously. "Smells like the tea Ma used to make when we got sick." "Yarrow," Charlie said suddenly, pointing at the plant. "Ma called it yarrow." Thomas nodded, the memory clicking into place. "You're right. She used to boil it for tea when we had the chills." With careful hands, Thomas prepared the yarrow tea as he had seen his mother do, steeping the dried leaves in hot water until the cabin filled with its pungent aroma. When it had cooled slightly, the children worked together to raise Swift Arrow's head and coax the liquid between his parched lips. As the sun began to set on the third day, Swift Arrow's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes to find Charlie curled up asleep beside him on the edge of the cot, her small hand resting protectively on his arm. Thomas sat at the table, whittling a piece of wood with Swift Arrow's knife, while William tended the fire, adding branches with methodical care. "Water!" Swift Arrow croaked, his throat raw from days of fever. 3 heads turned in unison, faces lighting with relief. Thomas quickly brought a cup of water, supporting Swift Arrow's head as he drank. "We thought you might die," William said bluntly, approaching the cot. Swift Arrow managed a weak smile. "Not yet. I have 3 reasons to live." The words came unbidden, surprising even himself, but as he looked at these children who had tended him with such care, he knew they were true. In the space of a few days, these orphaned white children had become his responsibility, his purpose. "The yarrow helped," Thomas said, gesturing to the herbs hanging nearby. "We found it here," and Charlie remembered what it was called. Swift Arrow nodded, recognizing the plant his own people used for similar purposes. "Ah, you have healing hands, all of you." As twilight deepened outside the cabin windows, Swift Arrow listened as the children recounted their efforts to keep him alive. Thomas described how they had taken turns keeping watch, both for his condition and for any sign of the cabin's owner returning. William proudly explained how he had melted snow for water and discovered a trapline that yielded 2 rabbits, which they had cooked following instructions Swift Arrow had given during a brief moment of lucidity. "And Charlie sang to you," Thomas added, glancing at his sister who ducked her head shyly. "Songs Ma used to sing when we were sick." Swift Arrow looked at the little girl with newfound appreciation. "Songs have power," he said softly. "Would my people believe they can guide lost spirits home?" Charlie's eyes widened. "Do your people have different songs than ours?" "Yes," Swift Arrow replied, but all songs speak the same language to the heart. William, ever practical, interrupted with a question that had clearly been bothering him. Whose cabin is this? Will they be angry we're here? Swift Arrow shifted, wincing as pain shot through his leg despite the improvement. The signs say a healer lives here. The herbs, the journal, this is a medicine man's place, or perhaps a woman who knows the old ways. Like a witch? William asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Swift Arrow shook his head. A healer, someone who understands the plants and the body's needs. He gestured around the cabin. They live alone, yet keep enough for visitors. They will understand our need. Thomas looked unconvinced, but nodded. Aye, if they come back, we'll explain. As night settled fully over the forest, the cabin grew quiet. The children, exhausted from their days of caretaking, fell asleep near the fire. Thomas sitting upright against the wall, William curled beside him, and Charlie nestled between them like a small bird in a nest. Swift Arrow watched them sleep, these children who had survived massacre only to face wolves, cold, and hunger. They had every reason to fear him, yet they had chosen trust instead. They had saved his life when many of his own kind would have left a wounded white man to die. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees and rattling the cabin's single window. Storm clouds obscured the stars, promising more snow by morning. Swift Arrow's thoughts turned to his tribe, camped far to the south. By now, they would have given him up for dead, another warrior lost to the endless conflicts that defined their lives. But here, in this small cabin deep in the wilderness, something new had begun. Swift Arrow felt it taking root within him, fragile yet persistent, like the first green shoot after a forest fire, hope. The promised storm arrived with the dawn, blanketing the forest in fresh snow and sealing them inside the cabin for days. Swift Arrow's strength returned gradually, like spring thawing frozen ground. By the fourth day, he could sit up without assistance. By the sixth, he could stand and hobble short distances with the aid of a walking stick William had fashioned from a sturdy branch. The forced confinement created an unexpected intimacy. The small cabin became a world unto itself, isolated from the conflicts that had shaped their separate lives. In this sanctuary, Swift Arrow began to teach the children the skills that had kept him alive in the wilderness. Always respect what you hunt, Swift Arrow explained as he showed Thomas how to properly clean and prepare the rabbits William had found in the traps. The animal gives its life so you may live. This is sacred. Thomas absorbed every lesson with intense concentration, his hands mimicking Swift Arrow's movements precisely. "Gepard taught us some, but not like this," he admitted. He was more concerned with getting the job done quick. Swift Arrow nodded. "Quick is good when hungry, but right is better." Charlie watched from her perch on a nearby chair, her small legs swinging. "Did your pa teach you these things?" she asked. Swift Arrow's hands paused briefly. "Yes, and his father before him." He resumed his work, deftly separating meat from bone. "For my people, knowledge passes from one generation to the next, like water flowing downstream." "What was your son like?" Charlie asked, with the direct innocence only children possess. "The one who got sick." Thomas shot his sister a warning look, but Swift Arrow raised a hand to indicate it was all right. "His name was Running Deer," Swift Arrow said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so long unspoken. "He was 4 winters old when the spotted sickness came, quick to laugh, quick to learn." A sad smile crossed his face. He was learning to use a bow. His arms were too small, but his spirit was big. The cabin fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Then Charlie slid from her chair and approached Swift Arrow, leaning against his side with casual affection. I bet he would have been brave like you. Swift Arrow rested a hand briefly on her head, touched by the simple gesture. And I think your mother would be proud of how you care for your brothers. William, who had been arranging kindling by the fireplace, looked up sharply. You think our Ma and Pa are watching us from wherever they are now? It was a question laden with grief and hope. Swift Arrow considered his answer carefully. Do my people believe our ancestors walk beside us even when we cannot see them? He said finally. They guide our steps and watch over our sleep. Pa said good folks go to heaven, Thomas contributed, his brow furrowed, but I don't know if heaven people can see us down here. The sky touches the earth at the horizon, Swift Arrow replied. Perhaps heaven and here are not so far apart. That evening, as snowflakes danced in the darkness beyond the cabin window, Swift Arrow taught the children to play a simple Apache game using small stones and markings drawn in the hearth ash. William, quick with numbers, caught on immediately, while Charlie delighted in the stories Swift Arrow told to accompany each move. Only Thomas remained somewhat reserved, participating but watching Swift Arrow with eyes that still held questions. Later, when Charlie and William had fallen asleep, Thomas sat across from Swift Arrow at the table, turning a stone over and over in his fingers. Why are you helping us? He asked finally, his voice low to avoid waking his siblings. Your people and our people are enemies. Those Indians killed our parents. Why didn't you just leave us for the wolves? Swift Arrow met the boy's gaze steadily. Those who killed your parents are not my people. They have forgotten the old ways, the honor code that says we do not harm children. But still, Thomas persisted, we're white. Your kind and our kind have been fighting since before I was born. Pa said Indians would kill us soon as look at us. And what did your father teach you about judging a man by his actions, not the color of his skin? Thomas looked away, conflict evident on his young face. He said a man proves himself by what he does, not what he says. Swift Arrow nodded. Wise words. He also said Indians couldn't be trusted, Thomas added, a challenge in his voice. And yet you trust me enough to sleep under this roof, Swift Arrow observed quietly, to eat food from my hands, to let me teach your brother and sister. Thomas had no response to this, his fingers still working the smooth stone. Trust is earned in small steps, Swift Arrow continued, like learning to walk again after injury. He gestured to his healing leg. Each day, we decide if we will take another step forward together, or if we will fall back into the old ways of fear. Thomas remained silent for a long moment. Then he placed the stone on the table between them. I don't know what's going to happen to us, he confessed, his voice suddenly that of a child again, not the protective older brother he had been trying so hard to be. Our aunt lives in St. Louis, but that's so far, and now with winter. For now, Swift Arrow said gently, you are safe. Tomorrow is a worry for tomorrow's light. As Thomas finally drifted to sleep, Swift Arrow remained at the table, turning the boy's stone in his fingers. The question of what would become of these children weighed heavily on him. His own tribe would be moving with the seasons, following game southward. The nearest white settlement was hostile to Apache, and the journey there would be perilous in winter conditions. For the first time, Swift Arrow allowed himself to consider a possibility that had been forming in the back of his mind. Perhaps these children were not merely a temporary responsibility. Perhaps they were a gift from the spirits, a chance to heal the wound that had never closed after losing his own family. Outside, the storm began to abate, the wind dropping to a whisper as if listening for his decision. Morning broke clear and cold, the storm having swept through like an angry spirit, leaving pristine snowdrifts in its wake. Swift Arrow stood in the doorway of the cabin, breathing deeply of the crisp air. His leg, though still stiff, had healed enough for him to consider their next steps. The question of where to go weighed heavily on his mind. Behind him, the children were engaged in the morning routines they had established over the past week. Thomas stoked the fire, while William arranged their meager breakfast of dried meat and the last of the beans. Charlie hummed softly as she folded the blankets they had slept under. The domesticity of the scene stirred something in Swift Arrow's chest, a feeling he had thought long buried with his wife and son. These children had awakened it, bringing both comfort and pain with their presence. His contemplation was interrupted by the distant crunch of snow beneath steady footsteps. Swift Arrow tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Someone's coming," he said quietly, stepping back inside and closing the door. One person, walking with purpose. Thomas immediately moved in front of his siblings, his face set in determination. "Oh, what do we do?" Swift Arrow assessed their options quickly. "No time to run. We stay. Explain why we are here." He glanced at his healing leg. "I cannot move quickly if trouble comes." "We won't leave you," Charlie said firmly, clutching her rag doll, a simple creation she had fashioned from scraps of cloth found in the cabin. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside the door. A moment of silence followed, then 3 sharp knocks. Swift Arrow positioned himself between the children and the entrance, nodding to Thomas to open the door. The figure that stood on the threshold was not what any of them expected. A woman, tall, lean, and weathered, regarded them with piercing blue eyes. Grey streaked her dark hair, which was pulled back in a single thick braid. She wore men's trousers beneath a heavy coat of wolf fur, and a rifle was cradled comfortably in her arms. Her gaze took in the scene, the Apache warrior standing protectively before 3 white children, and her eyebrows rose slightly. "Well," she said in a voice rough from disuse, "this is certainly a surprise." For a tense moment, no one spoke. Then the woman leaned her rifle against the doorframe, a gesture of peace, and stepped inside, closing the door against the cold. "My name is Catherine Blackwood," she said, removing her gloves. "But this is my cabin you've been occupying." Swift Arrow inclined his head respectfully. "I am Swift Arrow of the Chiricahua Apache. We found shelter here during the storm. I was wounded." Catherine's eyes flicked to his leg, noting the bandage visible beneath his leggings. "And the children?" "Orphans," Swift Arrow replied simply. "Their parents were killed by renegades." "I found them surrounded by wolves." Catherine studied the children, her gaze softening slightly. "You have names, I presume?" Thomas stepped forward, standing tall despite his obvious nervousness. "I'm Thomas Miller. These are my brother and sister, William and Charlotte." "Charlie," the little girl corrected, peering around Swift Arrow's leg. Catherine nodded, then moved to the fireplace, warming her hands. "You've kept things in good order, I see. And you found my herbs." She gestured to the bundles hanging from the rafters. "Used them too, by the look of it." "For his fever," Thomas explained, indicating Swift Arrow. "The yarrow helped." "It would," Catherine agreed. She turned to Swift Arrow, her expression unreadable. "You're a long way from your people, Apache." "As are you," Swift Arrow responded, noting her solitary existence in this remote cabin. A ghost of a smile crossed Catherine's face. "True enough." She glanced around the cabin once more, then seemed to come to a decision. "Well, you might as well sit. I've brought fresh meat, and you look like you could all use a proper meal." The tension in the room eased, though did not disappear entirely. As Catherine busied herself preparing venison she had carried in her pack, Swift Arrow and the children exchanged uncertain glances. "Are you a medicine woman?" Charlie asked finally. Unable to contain her curiosity, Catherine paused in her work. "Some might call me that, others have used less flattering terms." She continued slicing the meat into a pot. "And I prefer to think of myself as a student of nature's wisdom, like Swift Arrow," Charlie said with childish certainty. "He knows about plants too, and animals, and the stars." Catherine's eyes met Swift Arrow's over the child's head. "Does he now?" There was something in her tone, not mockery but assessment. As the venison stew simmered, filling the cabin with its rich aroma, Catherine drew out the children's story with gentle but direct questions. They described the attack on their homestead, their desperate flight, and how Swift Arrow had saved them from the wolves despite his own injury. "And now," she asked, looking to Swift Arrow, "what are your plans for these children?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Swift Arrow felt the children's eyes on him, waiting for his answer. "They have an aunt in St. Louis," he said carefully, "but the journey would be dangerous in winter." Catherine nodded. "Nearly impossible, I'd say. Not until spring thaw at the earliest. We could stay with Swift Arrow," Charlie suggested, her small hand finding his larger one. Catherine observed this gesture with interest. "Could you now?" "And what would your people think of that, Apache?" It was a fair question, and one Swift Arrow had been wrestling with himself. "My tribe moves with the seasons. Life is hard. And 3 more mouths." He left the sentence unfinished. "And 3 white children with an Apache warrior would raise questions wherever you went," Catherine added bluntly. Swift Arrow could not deny this. The world beyond this cabin was not kind to those who crossed the boundaries between their peoples. "They could stay here," Catherine said unexpectedly, "with me until spring makes travel possible." The offer hung in the air like smoke, unexpected, intangible, yet changing everything in its presence. Silence followed Catherine's offer, broken only by the bubbling of the stew and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Charlie's grip on Swift Arrow's hand tightened, her small fingers digging into his palm. "No," she said finally, her voice surprisingly firm for one so young. "We stay with Swift Arrow." Catherine's expression remained neutral, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of understanding. "The world isn't kind to those who defy its boundaries, little one." "She's right, Charlie," Thomas said quietly, always the practical one. "We can't go back to Apache territory with Swift Arrow." William looked between the adults, confusion evident on his face. "But we're family now, aren't we? That's what you said, Thomas. You said we were Swift Arrow's family now." Swift Arrow felt something catch in his throat at the boy's words. Family. It was a concept he had abandoned hope for after the smallpox took his wife and son. Yet somehow, against all odds, these children had carved a place in his heart. "It is not so simple," Swift Arrow said gently. "My people are moving south for winter hunting. The journey is hard, and some warriors still carry anger against whites. Like the men who killed our parents," Thomas said, his voice flat. Swift Arrow nodded. "There is hatred on both sides. A poison that has seeped deep." Catherine moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered forest. "I came here to escape that poison," she said, almost to herself. Then, turning back to them, "My husband was a Blackfoot warrior. Tall Bull was his name. We lived between worlds, never fully accepted by either. When he was killed by white settlers who couldn't abide our union, I found no welcome among his people or mine." Her revelation hung in the air, shifting the atmosphere in the cabin. Swift Arrow studied her with new understanding, this solitary woman who had crossed the same boundaries he now faced. "How long have you lived here alone?" he asked. "7 winters," she replied. "I trade with trappers who don't ask questions and occasionally treat those who find their way to my door. Indian, white, sickness and injury don't discriminate." Charlie had moved to Catherine's side, looking up at her with newfound curiosity. "Did you and Tall Bull have children?" Catherine's face softened momentarily. "A son. He died of fever when he was 5. "Like Swift Arrow's boy?" Charlie said softly. Catherine's eyes met Swift Arrow's, a moment of recognition passing between them, the shared wound of outliving one's child. "The children would be safe with you," Swift Arrow acknowledged, "but they have grown accustomed to my presence." "And you to theirs," Catherine observed. It wasn't a question. Swift Arrow did not deny it. These children had awakened something he had thought long dead, a capacity for tenderness, for hope. "There might be another way," Catherine said after a thoughtful pause. "My cabin is small but adequate. You could remain here, at least until your leg is fully healed and the worst of winter passes." Thomas looked up sharply. "You mean all of us? Together?" Catherine nodded. "I've lived alone a long time, perhaps too long." She stirred the stew, avoiding their eyes. "And an extra hunter would be useful." Swift Arrow considered her offer carefully. Staying meant delaying his return to his tribe, who might have already presumed him dead. Yet the thought of parting from the children sent a pain through his chest, sharper than any physical wound. "My people will move on without me," he said finally. "I would be considered lost until spring." "So you'll stay?" Charlie asked, hope brightening her eyes. Before Swift Arrow could answer, a distant sound caught his attention, the jingle of harness bells, carried on the cold air. Catherine heard it too, her body tensing as she moved swiftly to the window. "Riders," she said tersely, 3, maybe 4, following the stream path. Swift Arrow joined her at the window, keeping his body hidden behind the rough-hewn logs. In the distance, he could make out mounted figures moving slowly through the snow. "Oh, cavalry?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with fear. Catherine shook her head. "Trappers by the look of them. They sometimes stop here on their way to the trading post." Swift Arrow exchanged a glance with her, understanding the unspoken concern. Trappers were unpredictable. Some were fair-minded men who had forged respectful relationships with indigenous tribes. Others were little more than brigands who viewed Indians as obstacles to be eliminated. "They must not see me here," Swift Arrow said quietly. Catherine nodded. "There's a root cellar beneath the cabin, small, but it will hide you if needed." William looked panicked. "What if they're bad men? What if they hurt you or take us away?" Swift Arrow crouched before the boy, placing steady hands on his shoulders. "Catherine is respected by these men. They will not harm her or you, and I will be close, listening. If danger comes, I will protect you. Promise?" William asked, his lower lip trembling. Swift Arrow nodded solemnly. "I promise on the spirits of my ancestors." As the sound of the approaching riders grew louder, Catherine quickly helped Swift Arrow descend into the small cellar accessed through a trapdoor beneath a rug. It was cramped and smelled of earth and stored roots, but it would serve its purpose. Before closing the trapdoor, Catherine paused. "Whatever happens, don't reveal yourself unless there's no other choice. Some of these men shoot before they ask questions." Swift Arrow nodded his understanding. As the trapdoor closed above him, plunging him into darkness, he heard Catherine instructing the children on what to say if asked about their presence. In the close confines of the cellar, Swift Arrow closed his eyes and sent a silent prayer to the ancestors, He had found these children in the wilderness, saved them from wolves, and nursed them through cold and hunger. Now, huddled in darkness as strangers approached, he made a silent vow. He would not lose them now, not to prejudice or fear or the arbitrary boundaries drawn by men. Family, William had called them. And for the first time since he had lost his wife and son, Swift Arrow allowed himself to embrace the word fully, with all its promise and peril. From his hiding place beneath the floorboards, Swift Arrow listened to the heavy boots stomping snow off at the threshold. The trapdoor above him filtered voices, but obscured words, like listening to conversation through rushing water. He steadied his breathing, hand resting on his knife, every sense alert for signs of danger to the children. Above, Catherine greeted the newcomers with practiced neutrality. "Mackie, Jenkins, been a while." "Miss Blackwood," a gruff voice responded, "saw your smoke. Thought we'd warm ourselves before pushing onto the trading post." 3 men entered, filling the small cabin with their bulk and the sharp scent of unwashed bodies and tobacco. The tallest, a bearded man with a scar running from eye to jaw, immediately noticed the children. "Well now, what have we here?" he asked, surprise evident in his tone. Catherine's voice remained steady. "Orphans, found them half-frozen 3 days back. Parents killed in a raid to the east." The scarred man, Mackie, crouched before Thomas, studying him with narrowed eyes. "Indians got your folks, boy." Thomas stood rigid, aware of Swift Arrow hidden beneath his feet. "Yes, sir," he answered, his voice carefully controlled. "Painted warriors. At night." Mackie nodded, a dark satisfaction in his expression. "Been seeing more attacks this winter, savages getting desperate with the cold." He glanced at Catherine. "You planning on keeping them?" "Until spring," Catherine replied, "then to their aunt in St. Louis, if the pass clears." The second trapper, a wiry man with tobacco-stained teeth, helped himself to a cup of the venison stew. "Generous of you, Miss Blackwood. 3 more mouths to feed." "I manage," Catherine said simply. Below, Swift Arrow silently shifted position, his leg cramping in the confined space. A spider crawled across his hand, but he remained motionless, listening intently to each word, each inflection that might signal threat. "Heard something interesting at the fort?" the third trapper said, settling his considerable weight onto one of the chairs. "Patrol found a dead crow warrior few days back, arrow in his chest. Apache make, they said." Swift Arrow tensed, the crow he had killed during his escape. "Apache?" Catherine's voice betrayed nothing. "They're usually farther south this time of year. That's what makes it peculiar," the man continued. "Word is there might be a war party moving through, looking for new hunting grounds, maybe. Or just looking for trouble," Mackie added darkly. "Found tracks too," they said. "Single brave, wounded by the blood trail." "Heading this direction." Charlie, who had been silent since the men arrived, suddenly spoke up. "There's no Indians here, just us." Swift Arrow closed his eyes briefly, grateful for the child's instinctive protection, but concerned her eagerness might raise suspicion. "That's so, little miss?" Mackie asked, his tone softening slightly when addressing the girl. "Well, that's good to hear." The third trapper rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered clearing. "Wouldn't mind catching that Apache myself. Military's offering a bounty, $50 for a renegade." "I'm not a bounty hunter, Simmons," Catherine said coldly, "and neither are you, last I checked." "Times are lean," Simmons replied with a shrug. "And one less Indian means one less threat to folks like these young'uns." William, who had been pressed against Thomas's side, suddenly stepped forward. "Not all Indians are bad," he said firmly. "Some are good and kind and teach you things." A weighted silence followed the boy's declaration. Swift Arrow felt pride swell in his chest, even as concern for William's safety sharpened his senses further. Mackie chuckled, though the sound held no warmth. "That right, boy. And what would you know about Indians?" Thomas quickly placed a protective hand on his brother's shoulder. "Our pa traded with friendly tribes sometimes, before he was killed." Catherine moved to the fireplace, casually positioning herself between the children and the trappers. "The stew's hot if you're hungry, gentlemen. But if you're planning to reach the trading post by nightfall, you'd best not linger." The implicit dismissal wasn't lost on the men. Mackie studied Catherine's face, then glanced around the cabin once more. "Always did keep to yourself, didn't you, Miss Blackwood?" he observed, "even after what Indians did to your husband." A tense silence followed. Below, Swift Arrow held his breath, piecing together this new information. Catherine had said her husband was Blackfoot, killed by settlers, yet these men believed otherwise. "My past is my own," Catherine replied evenly. "As is my home. You've warmed yourselves. Now I'd appreciate you continuing on your way." Mackie seemed about to object when a sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin door, followed by the distant howl of a wolf. "Storm's picking up again," he noted. "We should move before we lose the light." The men gathered their things, Simmons helping himself to another ladleful of stew before donning his coat. At the door, Mackie paused, looking back at the children. "You young'uns be careful," he said. "If you see any sign of Indians around here, you tell Miss Blackwood right away, you hear?" Charlie nodded solemnly. "Are we promised to tell if we see any bad Indians?" Something in her emphasis made Mackie look at her more closely, but whatever suspicion might have formed was interrupted by Jenkins calling from outside. After the men departed, Catherine waited by the window, watching until they were well out of sight before moving to the center of the room and pulling back the rug. "They're gone," she said, opening the trapdoor. Swift Arrow emerged, stretching his stiff limbs, his eyes immediately seeking out the children. All three rushed to him, Charlie wrapping her arms around his waist while the boys hovered close, as if reassuring themselves of his continued presence. "You did well," Swift Arrow told them. "Very brave." Catherine was still at the window, her posture tense. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Mackie's no fool. He'll have questions about 3 orphans appearing suddenly." Swift Arrow nodded. "And about your husband." Catherine turned to face him, her expression guarded. "You heard that?" "Yes." Swift Arrow didn't press further, respecting her privacy. "People believe what's easier for them to understand," she said after a moment. "A white woman widowed by savage Indians makes more sense than a white woman who loved one." She moved to tend the fire. "But the truth is complicated, like most things worth protecting." Swift Arrow understood then why she had chosen this solitary existence, not just escape from prejudice, but the freedom to preserve her own truth, undiluted by others' expectations. "We should prepare," he said, mind turning to practical matters. "If those men are hunting Apache, they may return with more questions, or with soldiers." Thomas looked up, alarm clear on his face. "Will they take you away?" The fear in the boy's voice pierced Swift Arrow deeper than he expected. "Not if I can prevent it." "We won't let them," Charlie declared firmly, still clinging to him. Catherine's expression softened as she watched this exchange. "Those children have chosen you," she observed. "As clearly as if they were born to you." Swift Arrow met her gaze, recognizing the unspoken understanding between them, 2 souls who had defied the boundaries of their worlds for love and suffered for it. "Then I must be worthy of their choice," he replied. Outside, The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of another storm. But inside the cabin, something else stirred, a resolve that would soon be tested in ways none of them could anticipate. 3 days passed in watchful tension. Catherine reinforced the cabin's provisions, while Swift Arrow fashioned new arrows from straight branches and taught the children to move silently through the snow. Each morning, he scanned the horizon for signs of returning trappers. Each night, he sat beside the children's sleeping forms, knife in hand, listening for approaching hoofbeats. On the 4th morning, Swift Arrow woke before dawn with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. The air felt charged, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. He moved quietly to the window, careful not to wake the others. The forest was silent, too silent. No birds called, no small creatures rustled through the underbrush. Swift Arrow had lived by such signs long enough to recognize their warning. "Catherine," he called softly, waking her from where she slept near the fire. She rose immediately, reading his expression. "They're coming," Swift Arrow nodded. "Soon, the forest speaks of strangers." Catherine moved with practiced efficiency, gathering essential supplies into a pack. "There's a cave system about 3 miles north. Difficult to find if you don't know where to look." "You've prepared for this," Swift Arrow observed. A grim smile touched her lips. "I've lived between worlds too long not to have an escape route." They woke the children, speaking in hushed tones as they explained the situation. Thomas immediately began helping Catherine pack food and medicines, while William gathered their few personal possessions. Charlie simply stood beside Swift Arrow, her small hand finding his as naturally as a leaf turns towards sunlight. "Will we come back?" she asked quietly. Swift Arrow knelt to meet her eyes. "That depends on what follows us, little one." "I don't want to leave," she said, glancing around the cabin that had become home. But I want to stay with you more." Her simple declaration settled something in Swift Arrow's heart, a question he had been wrestling with since Catherine's arrival. Regardless of what came next, his path was now bound to these children. As they prepared to depart, a sound froze them all in place, the distant but unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses approaching at speed. "Too late," Catherine muttered, moving to the window. "At least 8 riders." Military escort. By the formation. Swift Arrow's mind raced, calculating options. The children couldn't move fast enough through deep snow to escape mounted pursuers. The cave system Catherine mentioned would be a sanctuary only if they reached it undetected. "I will lead them away," he decided, reaching for his newly crafted bow, create a false trail south. "No!" Charlie cried, clutching his leggings. "They'll shoot you." Swift Arrow gently detached her grip. "They must follow me to shoot me, little hawk, and I am not easy to catch." Catherine shook her head. "It's too dangerous. There's another way." She hesitated, then continued. "I have standing with the military commander at Fort Laramie. Captain Reynolds owes me his life. I treated his wounds when no one else could stop the infection. If I vouch for you..." "An Apache warrior with 3 white children," Swift Arrow said skeptically. "No debt is strong enough to overcome such suspicion." "Then we tell the truth," Thomas interjected firmly, "that you saved us from wolves, that you could have left us to die but didn't." Swift Arrow studied the boy's determined face. "Truth has little power against fear and prejudice, Thomas." "Then we make them listen," William insisted, his young face serious. "We don't let them take you." The riders were close now, their approach clearly audible. Swift Arrow made his decision. "I will not risk your safety by running," he told the children, "nor will I surrender to men who would judge me only by the color of my skin." He turned to Catherine. "We will meet them together. The children will speak their truth. And if these men have honor, they will listen. Catherine nodded, respect evident in her eyes. And if they don't? Swift Arrow's hand moved to his knife. Then I will do what I must to protect what is mine. The finality in his voice sent a shiver through the cabin. Catherine studied him for a long moment, then reached into a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards and extracted a revolver. "This was Tall Bull's," she said, checking that it was loaded. "I've never fired it in anger, but I will if they threaten these children or you." Swift Arrow nodded his thanks, both for the weapon and for her allegiance. As the riders entered the clearing before the cabin, Swift Arrow positioned himself at the center of the room. The children gathered behind him, Catherine at his side. They would face whatever came as a family, not by blood, but by choice. Captain James Reynolds dismounted first, a tall man with a military bearing softened by kind eyes. He approached the cabin cautiously, flanked by 6 soldiers and the trapper Mackie, whose smug expression suggested he expected reward for his information. "Catherine Blackwood," Reynolds called, "I've been told you're harboring an Apache warrior. I need you to send him out unarmed." Catherine opened the door but remained in the threshold, blocking their view inside. "James," she acknowledged, "it's been some time." "This isn't a social call, Catherine," Reynolds replied, though his tone remained respectful. "Mackie here says you've got 3 orphans and potentially a dangerous renegade. I need to see for myself." "Before you enter," Catherine said firmly, "I want your word that you'll listen to the full story, no hasty judgments." Reynolds studied her face, then nodded. "You have it. Though I can't promise what follows will be entirely my decision." Catherine stepped aside, revealing Swift Arrow standing tall in the center of the cabin. The children clustered protectively around him. The soldiers' hands moved to their weapons, but Reynolds held up a restraining hand. "Hold," he commanded, his eyes taking in the unexpected tableau before him. Mackie pushed forward. "That's him, the Apache they're hunting. $50 bounty, Captain." "Silence," Reynolds ordered, his gaze moving from Swift Arrow to the children and back again. "This is not what I expected." Swift Arrow met the captain's eyes steadily. "Nor was it what I expected when I found 3 children facing wolves in the snow." Thomas stepped forward, his voice stronger and clearer than Swift Arrow had ever heard it. "He saved us, Captain. Our parents were killed by raiders, and we were lost. Swift Arrow was hurt himself, but he fought off the wolves all night. He could have left us, but he didn't. He taught us things," William added earnestly. "How to track and hunt and be quiet in the forest." Charlie, smallest but perhaps bravest, moved to stand directly between Swift Arrow and the soldiers. "He's our family now," she declared, her chin raised in defiance. "And we won't let you take him." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Reynolds' expression shifted from surprise to thoughtfulness as he assessed the scene before him. The Apache saved these white children?" he asked Catherine directly. "Yes," she confirmed. "At great risk to himself, he's been protecting them ever since, as you can see." Reynolds turned to Mackie. "You neglected to mention this part of the story." The trapper spat on the floor. "Don't change what he is. Apache's Apache, can't trust him." "And yet these children clearly do," Reynolds observed. He approached Swift Arrow slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I've fought your people," he said frankly, "lost good men to Apache arrows. And my people have lost many to cavalry bullets." Swift Arrow replied evenly. Reynolds nodded, acknowledging the truth of this. "What are your intentions with these children?" It was the question Swift Arrow had been asking himself since the night he found them in the snow. Now, with soldiers waiting for his answer and 3 small faces looking up at him with complete trust, the truth emerged with crystal clarity. To be their father he said simply, "to raise them with honor, to teach them the wisdom of both our peoples, and to protect them with my life if necessary." Charlie's hand slipped into his, a silent affirmation of his words. Reynolds looked from Swift Arrow to the children, then to Catherine, whose steady gaze offered neither plea nor demand, only quiet certainty. Outside, the wind picked up, snow beginning to swirl as the promised storm finally arrived. Inside, fates hung in balance as a cavalry captain weighed duty against humanity, and an Apache warrior stood ready to fight for the family he had never expected to find. Captain Reynolds removed his hat, a gesture that seemed to signify the man taking precedence over the uniform. Snow drifted through the open door behind him, melting on the warm floorboards. "In 15 years of military service," he said slowly, "I've seen the worst of what men can do to one another, Indian and white alike." His eyes moved from Swift Arrow to the children, then to Catherine. "But rarely have I witnessed the best." Mackie stepped forward impatiently. "Captain, with all due respect, regulations are clear. Any Apache this far north is presumed hostile and I am making a field assessment based on the evidence before me." Reynolds interrupted sharply. He studied Charlie, still standing protectively before Swift Arrow. "Young lady, are you afraid of this man?" Charlie looked bewildered by the question. "Of Swift Arrow?" "No, sir. He keeps the scary things away. And you boys," Reynolds asked Thomas and William, "do you wish to be separated from him?" Thomas straightened his shoulders. "No, sir. He's teaching us how to survive, how to be brave." William nodded vigorously beside his brother. "He tells us stories about the stars and animals, and he never gets angry when I ask too many questions." A ghost of a smile touched Reynolds' weathered face. He turned to Catherine. "And you, what do you make of this arrangement?" Catherine met his gaze steadily. "I've lived long enough to recognize a family when I see one, James. It may not look like what you expect, but it's no less real for that." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully, then turned back to Swift Arrow. "I fought alongside Navajo scouts in the Apache campaigns. Good men, honorable warriors." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "I learned that character isn't determined by the color of a man's skin, despite what many of my fellow officers believe." Swift Arrow remained silent, sensing that the captain was working through his decision aloud. Reynolds continued, "My orders are to investigate reports of a renegade Apache. What I find instead is a man protecting orphaned children." He placed his hat back on his head. Decision made. "In as far as my report will show, the Apache brave was tracked heading south. The trail was lost in the storm." Mackie's face contorted with anger. "This is against regulations. That Indian has a bounty, which you will not collect." Reynolds cut him off coldly. "Unless you wish me to investigate how you came by those Cheyenne scalps in your saddlebag." "I believe the penalty for scalp hunting is still quite severe." The trapper paled, taking an involuntary step backward. Reynolds turned to his men. "Prepare to ride. The storm's worsening, and we need to reach the fort by nightfall." As the soldiers filed out, Reynolds addressed Swift Arrow once more. "This territory is changing. Settlers push farther west each season. These children need protection not just from wolves, but from a world that may not understand the choice you've all made." Swift Arrow nodded. "I am aware of the challenges." "Catherine," Reynolds said, turning to her, "the military presence in this region will increase come spring. This cabin may not remain as isolated as you've preferred." Catherine's expression revealed nothing. "And you will manage. I'm sure you will," Reynolds replied with a hint of admiration. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, handing it to her. This grants you official status as a medical contractor to Fort Laramie. Should anyone question your household arrangements, this provides some protection. Catherine accepted the paper, surprise briefly crossing her features. "Thank you, James." Reynolds nodded once more to Swift Arrow, a gesture between equals, then departed, closing the door firmly against the intensifying storm. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Charlie broke the silence, tugging at Swift Arrow's hand. "Does this mean we can stay together? All of us?" Swift Arrow lifted her into his arms, something he had never done before. The little girl's arms wrapped around his neck with complete trust. Yes, little hawk, we stay together." Thomas approached, relief evident on his face. "But what happens when spring comes? Will you go back to your people?" It was the question that had lingered unspoken between them. Swift Arrow looked to Catherine, whose steady gaze offered neither pressure nor expectation. "My people move with the seasons," Swift Arrow said carefully. "But sometimes a warrior must make his own path." He set Charlie down and knelt before all three children. "If you wish it, I will be your father not just through this winter, but for all winters to come." "We wish it," Charlie said immediately, speaking for all of them. Thomas nodded, tears welling in his eyes despite his efforts to appear stoic. "But what about Aunt Julia in St. Louis?" Catherine stepped forward. "We could write to her. Explain what's happened. She may be relieved to know you're safe and cared for." "And if she insists on taking them?" Swift Arrow asked quietly. Catherine's expression hardened slightly. "Then she would need to come and make her case, by which time these children will have been part of this family for months. No court would easily separate them from those they've chosen." The storm outside intensified, rattling the cabin windows. Yet inside, the atmosphere had lightened, as if a great weight had been lifted from all their shoulders. That evening, they shared a meal unlike any before, not as temporary allies, but as a family choosing to forge a future together. Swift Arrow told stories of his boyhood, of Apache wisdom, and the lessons his own father had taught him. Catherine revealed more of her life with Tall Bull, the beauty and hardship of their love. The children spoke of their parents, memories preserved rather than buried, honored in the telling. As night fell and the children drifted to sleep by the fire, Swift Arrow and Catherine sat at the table, voices low. "It won't be easy," she said, watching the sleeping children. "The world has little tolerance for those who defy its boundaries." "The world is changing," Swift Arrow replied, echoing Reynolds' words. "Perhaps not quickly enough, but changing nonetheless." Catherine studied him thoughtfully. "And you, are you prepared to change? To live neither fully in your world nor in theirs, but somewhere in between?" Swift Arrow considered the question seriously. "When smallpox took my family, I believed the spirits had abandoned me. I became a shadow moving through life without purpose." He looked at the children, his expression softening. "And now I understand that loss carved space for a new purpose." "They've healed something in you," Catherine observed. "As you recognized when you offered us shelter," Swift Arrow replied. "You saw yourself in me, a soul between worlds." Catherine didn't deny it. "I've lived alone a long time, thought it was safer that way. And now," a small smile touched her lips, "now I'm harboring an Apache warrior and 3 orphans with the U.S. Cavalry aware of our existence. Safe seems a relative term." Swift Arrow almost smiled in return. "Life offers no guarantees. My people say that to live fully is to accept risk." "Wise people," Catherine acknowledged. Spring came to the mountains with gentle persistence, melting the snow in stages, coaxing green shoots from the cold earth. The cabin had expanded over the winter months. A new room added for the boys, repairs made to the roof and walls. A corral built for the horses Swift Arrow had traded for with passing Shoshone. On a warm May morning, Swift Arrow stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. Charlie perched on his shoulders, while Thomas and William practiced tracking a rabbit through the underbrush. The boys had grown taller over the winter, their bodies stronger, their spirits resilient. Charlie had blossomed from a frightened child into a curious, talkative little girl who followed Swift Arrow like a shadow, absorbing his teachings about plants and animals with eager attention. "Papa," she said, the name she had begun using for him after the soldiers' visit, "will we stay here forever?" Swift Arrow lifted her down to stand beside him on the ridge. "What do you think, little hawk?" Charlie considered the question with the seriousness she applied to all matters. "I think home isn't a place, it's people." She slipped her hand into his. "So we're already home." Swift Arrow felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest, the sensation that had become common in these months of fatherhood. "Wiser words have never been spoken," he told her. From below, Catherine called them to the cabin. A letter had arrived from St. Louis. Aunt Julia's response to their careful explanation of the children's circumstances. They gathered around the table as Catherine read it aloud, the children tense with anticipation. Julia's words were cautious, but not unkind. She expressed gratitude that the children had survived and found care. While she admitted concern about their unusual living arrangement, she acknowledged her own limitations. A widow with modest means and failing health, she had feared being unable to properly care for 3 active children. She requested regular letters and promised to visit when her health permitted. "She's not going to take us away," William said, relief evident in his voice. "No," Catherine confirmed, folding the letter. "It seems she's given her blessing in her own way." That night, as moonlight spilled through the cabin window, Swift Arrow completed a project he had worked on in secret moments throughout the winter. 4 small medicine pouches, carefully crafted from soft deer hide, each containing a stone from the stream where he had first encountered the children, a feather from an eagle that had circled above the cabin, and herbs gathered from the mountainside. He presented them solemnly, first to Thomas, then William, then Charlie, and finally to Catherine, who accepted hers with surprise and evident emotion. "These contain protection," Swift Arrow explained. "In Apache tradition, they bind us as family, not by blood, but by choice, the strongest bond of all." "Like adoption?" Thomas asked, running his fingers over the intricate beadwork. Swift Arrow nodded. "Yes, but more than papers or words can express, a binding of spirits." Charlie immediately hung hers around her neck. "Now we're really yours," she said with satisfaction. "And I am yours," Swift Arrow replied, the simple truth of it filling him with peace. Later, standing outside beneath the vast canopy of stars, Swift Arrow offered a prayer of gratitude to the ancestors. Once, he had believed his purpose ended with his family's death. Now he understood that life's path rarely moves in expected directions. A wounded Apache warrior, 3 orphaned white children, a woman who had lived between worlds. Together, they had created something rare and precious, a family defined not by blood or race or convention, but by love, respect, and the courage to defy a divided world's expectations. Swift Arrow gazed up at the night sky, where his wife and son now dwelled among the stars. He could almost imagine their approval, their blessing on this new chapter. From within the cabin came the sound of children's laughter and Catherine's answering voice. Swift Arrow smiled and turned toward home, not the home he had once known, but the one he had found when he needed it most, in the hearts of 3 children who had taught him to live again.